All right, we are live. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today. For anyone who is already here, my name is Madison Mills. I'm a producer with QuickTake, and I am being joined today by Fiona Lowenstein, who is a 26-year-old who survived coronavirus, but you are still experiencing some symptoms weeks later. So we are very lucky to have the opportunity to chat with you. Just to start off, I'm wondering if you can just tell me how you're feeling today, how you're doing mentally and emotionally, but also physically, a few weeks after getting out of the hospital.
Yeah, for sure. So it's been over a month since I first developed symptoms, and about a month since I was discharged from the hospital. I'm, feeling obviously much better than I was a month ago. As you can see, I can carry on a conversation. I'm not having breathlessness, but certainly there are lingering symptoms. I would say headache, fatigue, some cognitive functioning issues, just some memory lapse, brain fog, that sort of thing, as well as continued congestion. So some mornings I'll wake up coughing up phlegm. Some mornings I'll feel better. It's been very on and off. Today so far has been a good day, but last night, I had headache late into the night, difficulty kind of looking at screens or reading anything after 4 p.m. So there is a strong chance that that'll reemerge this evening as well.
Sure, and I think it's so important. You've been doing such a great job sharing with people that it doesn't end when you're discharged from the hospital. So can you talk to me about your experience realizing that that wasn't necessarily the end of your experience with this virus?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would say my first week, I had the fever, I had the shortness of breath, which was what I was admitted to the hospital for. After I got home, I noticed that I was kind of initially feeling better. And the fever was gone, the shortness of breath was gone. I felt really excited because those were the main symptoms I'd had. So I figured if they were going away, I'd likely improve quickly. In my second week, I started to develop new symptoms. So pretty intense GI issues that made it impossible for me to kind of digest large meals or any normal food. I was just eating, a couple crackers a day at one point, and then really bad sinus pain and nasal congestion, which turned into a sore throat. So it was like a whole second phase of the virus, and now I'm kind of in this third phase that I think a lot of other people are experiencing as well, from what I can tell, which is this intense fatigue. And this has been a little bit of a plateau for me. I got some energy levels back initially, and the GI issues went away, but this fatigue and these headaches, I've been experiencing that pretty constantly and pretty consistently for the past, I would say, 2 weeks, and I'm not seeing that get much better. So I think the question on a lot of our minds, those of us who have survived and maybe have even recovered or are being talked about as having recovered, is what happens now. How long before I actually feel like my normal self, and what are the possible long-term issues that I could be facing with my physical health and my mental health. There's a lot of anxiety about relapsing into old symptoms, as well as just depression, when you look at this incredibly long, seemingly long road to recovery.
Absolutely. And I do want to get into the work that you're doing with fellow coronavirus survivors, but just to tell everyone who is watching us who we are and what we're doing real quickly, I'm Madison. I'm a producer with QuickTake by Bloomberg, and I am joined by Fiona Lowenstein, who is a 26-year-old who survived coronavirus. If you are watching, please comment with any questions you have, and I will ask them to you, Fiona. Also, we had users submit questions earlier today, and they sent in some amazing questions for you. So we're going to cover all of those as much as we can in the next half hour or so. But Fiona, just to start off, can you just, for anyone who doesn't know your story, can you give our audience a quick recap of what you've been going through the past month?
Sure. So I first got sick on Friday, March 13th. The first symptom was just a fever and a headache. And then the next morning noticed a cough. The following day, things started to get better. The fever seemed to be going down. And then I woke up in the middle of the night, that night, Sunday night into Monday morning, with what I now recognize as shortness of breath, but also with chills and vomiting. And at that point, GI issues were not really being talked about as part of the virus. So I was pretty confused about what was going on. I ended up going to the ER the following day as I kind of developed more severe shortness of breath. At the advice of my GP, who I was talking to on the phone. It got so bad at that point that I couldn't speak. My partner was actually communicating on my behalf with my doctor on the phone. I couldn't walk. I couldn't really eat. I couldn't breathe unless I was lying flat, just focusing on breathing. So that was the point where I went to the ER, ended up getting a COVID test, being admitted to the hospital, receiving oxygen. I was not on a ventilator. I was not in the ICU, but I had oxygen, and the oxygen slowly helped. So returned home after that, and I'm just dealing with kind of the long process of healing at this point.
Absolutely. And it just sounds like you've been through a lot through this process. And I know that you mentioned earlier that yesterday you got the hospital bill. Are you comfortable kind of sharing with us what that looked like for you?
Yeah, totally. So I was pretty freaked out about receiving the hospital bill and had been waiting a long time for it. And I'm very happy to say that I have insurance through New York State, which covered 99% of the bill. So the bill is almost $14,000. And again, that's for one night in the ER and one night in the hospital, 2 days in the hospital, I guess, or 3 days. And I am only paying $150. So again, I have insurance through New York State. It's based on my income, and thank God it covers the majority of my expenses because I don't have that much money. I wouldn't be able to really pay that bill on my own otherwise.
Right. And the financial impact is just one of the many things we don't fully know about how this virus will impact people who get it. Can you talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions that people might have about what it's like to have it or to survive it at all? Can you share some of those with us?
Totally. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and obviously this information has been disseminated by, the World Health Organization and the CDC, so I understand why people are kind of adhering to it, but there's this false binary between mild and severe cases. This idea that some people are, and the people that this happens to are mostly going to be young and healthy, are going to get this virus and be able to ride it out at home. And maybe it'll be a cold, maybe they'll have flu-like symptoms, but they'll be better within 2 weeks. And then on the other hand, there's the cases that we're seeing in the media a lot, some of which result in death, many of which result in people being put on ventilators or being hospitalized for weeks at a time. And that recovery rate is estimated at longer, at 6 weeks. But I'm talking to a lot of people who have had more mild symptoms than me, who maybe weren't even admitted to the hospital because they never reached that acute level, but who have been sick for over a month. And at the point where you're having a low-grade fever and coughing and shortness of breath for a month and a half, even if the symptoms are mild, that I don't know if we can really call that a mild case, right? That seems like something else entirely. So I think that's one of the big misconceptions. Another issue is that the symptoms that are being discussed in the news, it's taking a long time for the news cycle and for the again, the CDC and the WHO to kind of catch up with the symptoms that people are experiencing. So I know up until recently, GI symptoms still were not listed on the CDC's website as symptoms that you might experience with COVID, but so many of us have had them. Again, I had vomiting and later a lot of trouble digesting food and keeping basically putting on weight after losing a huge amount of weight while I had a fever. So I think that there's the GI symptoms. There's the question of neurological effects now with the loss of smell and taste and some of what I'm experiencing with this kind of brain fog, headaches. So there's just a lot we don't know, both about the long-term health effects, like what this will look like for people who have had this a year ago, right? Because no one has had this for more than, let's say, 3 months. But also the long-term effects that it'll have financially and emotionally and mentally. I mean, a lot of us who were hospitalized are dealing with PTSD, or just still trying to process kind of what life is going to look like for us if we've lost work as a result of being sick, or if we're still battling symptoms. I might think now 38 days out from the point of my first symptoms. So obviously my case was not mild because I was admitted to the hospital and I did have breathing issues. But I think, again, it's just important to kind of interrogate that binary between the mild and severe cases because there are a lot of people in need.
Absolutely. And just to remind our audience as well that Fiona, you had coronavirus, but neither of us are doctors. So just to make sure that you call your doctors if you have any specific health questions. I do want to touch on one question that we have from our audience, which is what's your understanding about your immunity now and any chances of reinfection? I know that's updating every day, but what's your understanding of your immunity right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's another area that a lot of survivors are feeling confused about. So, in terms of immunity, I really have no idea, right? I haven't been able to do an antibody test for a variety of reasons, and I can speak a little bit more to why it's difficult for some of us who are recovering to donate plasma or get antibody tests, and some of that has to do with accessibility of these testing locations if you're not feeling well. Some of it also has to do with actually being accepted into the test or the study, which is quite difficult, more difficult than it may seem. That being said, we also don't know that the existence of antibodies means immunity. So I think a lot of hopes are being put on the idea that we're going to be immune and we're going to kind of be able to move forward and maybe help out in certain ways. But most of us have not been guaranteed this in any way. Then there's the question of reinfection. I was initially told when I came home from the hospital to isolate from my partner, even though my partner seemed to also have coronavirus. They brought me to the hospital and they developed symptoms while there with me. My partner could not get a COVID test because they were so limited at that point. But even though they thought we both had COVID, they wanted us to isolate within our apartment just in case of reinfection, which we did for as long as they recommended and as much as possible in a small New York City apartment. But ultimately, it seems like a lot of these reinfection cases may also just be instances of relapse. So I'm talking to people who, feel better for 8 days and feel totally fine. And, they're just staying in their apartment, but they're starting to get back to regular life, exercising, working, their normal 8 or 9 hour day, even if they're working from home. And then the fever comes back. So I think with immunity, with reinfection, and especially with contagiousness, there's just still so little known that the responsible thing to do is continue to isolate. And that's really hard for those of us who have been sick for 30 plus days, 60 plus days. And there are those people out there. So it's something that I'm confused about, and I think that I'm waiting for more information on. I don't think I'm alone in that.
Absolutely. And I think another question a lot of people have is what's the likelihood of getting it if you're a relatively healthy person, which you experienced yourself. Can you talk about your fitness background and how that journey is going for you now that you've had the virus?
Totally. So, I don't have any pre-existing conditions, respiratory conditions. Otherwise, I lead a pretty healthy lifestyle, by most doctors' metrics. I am a yoga teacher and I typically work out 6 times a week and teach, 2 to 3 yoga classes a week. So that's, let's say, 8 or 9 times a week of exercise. I'm a dog walker. So I'm often active walking around. So I was really surprised that this hit me as hard as it did. And I think it shows that some of the assumptions that we have about health, and certainly the assumptions that we had about this virus, may not be accurate. So certainly young people, I'm seeing a lot of young people getting hit hard by this. We're also seeing a lot of people without pre-existing conditions be hit hard by this. And I think once again, it just demonstrates that it's going to be hard to draw connections between kind of someone's prior health background and how much this virus affects them. It might be possible to do so, but it doesn't seem as easy as we thought.
Right. And one question that we're getting from our audience that you've talked about previously is, do you know how you contracted the virus? Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm pretty certain that I got the virus from a friend who came to my house on Tuesday, March 10th. This was, I would say, the day before we all started kind of hearing that it was time to socially distance from each other here in New York City, which is where I'm based. So, me and this friend, we had what we assumed would be kind of one last in-person meeting before, everything happened and everyone had to stay in their own homes. And I tell this story because I know that there are still people who are visiting each other in each other's homes during quarantine, and just kind of goes to show she got to my house, felt fine, and I watched her become sick in front of me. Like, she was sitting on my couch, we were doing work together, and all of a sudden she just sort of started to get pale. She said, "I feel really awful." Of course, we both were terrified. We both were like, "You need to go home right away." She went home as quickly as she could, and then that Friday. So 3 days later, I had the same symptoms. She was never able to get a COVID test, again, because it's so difficult to get tested here in New York City. But as soon as I got my results, she was kind of the only person I'd had contact with in the past week. And we had really the exact same symptoms. So I think me getting results was actually very helpful to her, because then she was able to know more or less for certain that she had it as well. But again, one person came into my house. We weren't sharing food or sharing drinks or anything like that. She just sat on my couch next to me, and that's, I believe, how I got it. So.
Wow. And I want us to talk about your support group, but real quickly, a question for you about testing. You mentioned the last time we talked that just getting the test had an emotional impact for you. I'm wondering if you can share that with us and talk about your experience just getting that positive result.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was very lucky to get the test, and I'm not even sure why I did. I think it had something to do with the fact that I was being admitted to the hospital, but protocols were constantly changing. And even though I had the fever and I had the dry cough and I had the shortness of breath, and I also had some other symptoms that weren't being listed at that time as being related to COVID, even though I had all of that, I still had a lot of self-doubt, and there was still a part of me that felt like, am I making up this shortness of breath? Like, is this just a cold? Am I, going into kind of hyper anxiety mode because of what I'm seeing on the news? And when I ended up getting tested, I just remember, even though it was scary to know that I had coronavirus, it was such a relief to know that I could trust in myself, and to know that, all of these symptoms that I'd been experiencing really, really were symptoms that I had, and really were symptoms of this virus. And I've talked to a lot of other people, and specifically, I think a lot of young people and a lot of women who similarly questioned, what they were feeling. And obviously some of us are, socialized to not necessarily trust in everything that we feel. And so I think that, yeah, it was very affirming to me. And as I mentioned, it was affirming to my friend as well. When I was able to tell her, hey, I think you might have it too, she said she broke down and cried, because she was just so thankful to know what it was, and to know that she could trust in herself.
Right, of course. And can you share with us the work that you've done now, being home from the hospital, to support other coronavirus survivors?
Yeah, sure. So when I first got home from the hospital, I started sharing my story on Instagram. And of course, I wrote that first op-ed for the New York Times, kind of just about my experience getting really sick. And I started to hear from people all over the world, mostly young people, but a whole range of people who had symptoms and were feeling isolated. And I remembered, the first day I was sick, opening up Instagram and scrolling through my feed and seeing nothing but content on how to basically overcome boredom in quarantine, or how to not get coronavirus. So when you're lying in bed and you have coronavirus and you see that, it isolates you even more, right? Because social media is one of the few ways that we can connect with each other right now. So I started to realize that there really needed to be more of an online space for people with symptoms, or people who were recovering, to talk about what they were going through. So I initially launched the group chat just through Instagram. We had about 30 people in there. And then more and more people kept telling their friends. We moved to WhatsApp, and now we're on Slack. We have, I think, 1,500 people in the chat, maybe 2,000 more people waiting to join. It's people from all over the world, and it is incredible. Like, it is the most active group chat I've ever been a part of, and people are so forthcoming and have so much important information to share with each other. And there is so much common ground. I mean, almost every single time that someone says, hey, has anyone experienced this? Whether it's a medical symptom, a mental health issue, or, a financial issue, or an issue they're experiencing in their social life, there's at least 10 other people who are saying, yep, I had that exact same thing. So I think it's, once again, offering that kind of affirmation and validation that's hard to get right now, since so little is known about this virus, and since everyone who has it has to isolate. So it's been incredibly powerful and helpful for me, and I think it's been really helpful to others as well.
And can you share with our audience the form that you all are working on to kind of curate all of this information for any researchers who might need it?
Yeah, definitely. So we've had a couple different, groups and doctors reach out to us, just kind of asking what they can learn from this group. And I know a couple people in the group have also showed the forum to their doctor, and the doctor's kind of like, wow, this is a lot. So a couple people in the group just made a really detailed Google form survey, where they're just asking, I would say, more detailed information on symptoms than I've seen in any other survey that I've taken taken part in, partially because they've just aggregated kind of all of the data of what they've been hearing in the group. So I'll be sharing that link on my social media later today if there's any survivors or recovering people, or even people in, in the midst of symptoms who want to participate. And it doesn't matter if you've, tested positive or not. There's a whole section on that, kind of what your experience was with testing. And then, they have basically a chart where you can list your symptoms for 6 weeks, which is, again, a lot longer than I've seen. I think 6 or 7 weeks, which is longer than I've seen anywhere else, where they're kind of assuming that mild cases resolve in 2 weeks.
Right. Well, that's very powerful. And if anyone is watching who's interested in joining, I'm sure we can direct them to your social accounts to kind of follow up with you on that. I want to go to some audience questions that we're getting as we start to get to the end of this. But just as a reminder, I'm Madison. I'm a producer with QuickTake. I'm joined here by Fiona, who is sharing her experience surviving coronavirus with us. Some audience questions that we're getting. One is, have you ever had an illness like this before? What's the closest comparison?
That's a great question. And I will say, I'll address that, but I'll also say that one thing this has really done is it has opened up my mind to, a lot of the ways in which I think I had kind of an ableist view on life, right? I haven't experienced chronic illness or disability in the past, and I'm recognizing so many of the issues that I've seen talked about in those communities. That being said, I did have mono when I was in high school, and I would say that's probably the closest thing to what I'm experiencing right now, just because I was sick for a month, and I experienced a lot of fatigue and weakness afterward. And I remember I couldn't play on the high school varsity soccer team that I was supposed to play on, so a similar kind of blow to my hubris as an active person. But yeah, that's the closest comparison. Other than that, I really have been blessed to not have to deal with chronic illness or fatigue in my life in the past.
Absolutely. And another question that we have is, what was the mood of the medical workers who you interacted with at the hospital?
That's a great question. It was mixed. I mean, they were incredibly supportive. They were very transparent about how little information they were getting and how difficult kind of the situation was, how protocols were constantly changing. And I appreciated that. It made me feel to some extent like I was also there to support them. They're going through something just so incredibly difficult right now. I think the lines of communication were almost more open than they usually are between a doctor and a patient, because, they were saying to me, oh my God, this is so crazy. I haven't been given the right clothing to wear, the right protective gear, and I haven't been tested, and I'm scared that I've been exposed. And I was able to say to them, like, I'm so sorry. And, you don't normally have that dynamic when you're being treated in the hospital. So they were frazzled for sure. Definitely not as they weren't dealing with as much as they're dealing with now. But they were dealing with a lot, and they were worried. And I did have one nurse say to me, I'm very scared that I might have to make decisions about who lives and who dies. And I just don't feel equipped to do that. So, they're going through a lot, but I can't thank them enough. They were there for me physically and emotionally. When I got wheeled into the hospital to be admitted from the ER, I was crying because I was scared to be alone. I've never been hospitalized before, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to have any visitors or anything. And, the nurses just immediately kind of, said, oh, Fiona, what's wrong? You're going to be okay. And everything. And it was so heartening. And I became friendly with a lot of them. So, my heart goes out to anyone working in a hospital right now, because it is so, so difficult. And they didn't have a choice in this, and they're absolutely handling it with such grace.
I'm so glad that even though it was, of course, a traumatic experience, that there was also some levity in the hospital for you as well. I think something a lot of people are worried about right now is the idea of having to go in alone. So it's good to hear that you had support from the folks who could be in there with you.
Yeah. No, I was very grateful for that. And obviously being alone in a situation like that, when you're that physically vulnerable, is incredibly scary. And I can relate to it. And I wasn't even in the ICU. So I can't imagine the fear that, people are experiencing who are completely by themselves for more than a couple of days in the hospital.
Sure. And now that it's been, how many weeks has it been since you've been home?
So I think it's been about a month exactly since I came home. I was discharged from the hospital on March 18th or 19th.
So it's been a month of being out of the hospital. You're starting to lightly exercise again, it sounds like. I'm wondering if you can just tell our audience what life looks like for you right now, and where you think, I know it's hard to see too far in the future with a virus like this, but how you think the next few months might transpire for you.
Totally. So, yeah, I mean, I am both blessed and cursed to be a gig economy worker and to be only working part time right now. Obviously, it's a financial concern for me, and one that will only become, more more persistent as time goes on. But because I'm working part time, I've had, I think, a lot more opportunity to rest and recover than many other people that I'm talking to who, may be working from home, but they're still expected to be on their computers, for 8 or 9 hours a day. So the biggest thing is I've been trying to let myself sleep as much as possible, and I'm sleeping about 12 hours every night, 10 to 12 hours. And then as you mentioned, started exercising. I think maybe on week 3 or 4, I started doing some very light yoga and stretching. It's this very hard line to walk because you're trying to, kind of make sure that your body doesn't atrophy further and that you're able to regain some physical strength, but you also don't want to push yourself so hard that you relapse or you're too exhausted to do anything else. But for the past 7 days or so, and I shared this on social media, and I kind of waited until it had been a week just to make sure that I was actually doing it. But the past 7 days or so, I have been able to do like some light dance cardio in the mornings, Jane Fonda YouTube videos and all that. So it's very low impact. It's, a lot shorter and less intense than the stuff that I usually do, but it has been genuinely thrilling to like move my body and feel that rush of adrenaline, even if only for a little bit. And then I would say I'm typically, spending maybe 4 or 5 hours on my computer doing work, but the more time I spend on there, the worse my headache in the evenings is. So it's still just a lot of time kind of lying on my couch or lying in bed, either listening to music and staring out the window, or sometimes watching a movie or a TV show. I know I was telling you earlier, I've almost developed a weird sense of mindfulness because life is so slow paced for me right now. And I have to give myself these breaks. I'll find myself, as I said, just kind of looking out my window for 20, 30 minutes, which is something that ordinarily I would never do because I'm usually running from activity to activity and kind of don't give myself that time. So it's an interesting way of life. It can certainly be a little boring at times, and I am dealing with anxiety and depression, but just really, really thankful that I'm slowly being able to use some of my energy toward activities like exercise or running the support group that bring me a lot of joy.
Absolutely. I'm glad that there are some things that you can still do, like bake and exercise a little bit. Fiona, I think we're going to start to wrap up, but I wanted to ask, is there anything that we did not touch on about your experience that you want to add before we wrap up?
Sure. So I think, the only other thing I'll say is, as you mentioned, this is just my experience. And while I said that there's certainly a lot of common ground between the other people that I'm talking to, every experience is different. So I think it's really important, if you have a friend who's sick or a family member who's sick, not to kind of impose your own framework of what you think illness or recovery looks like, or what I'm saying it looks like, because it really is going to present differently for everyone. And people can use a lot of support even after the point of acute symptoms. And then the other thing I'll say is, I know I'm kind of in some ways have become a face of this virus, and certainly a face of, what this virus looks like for young people. I think it's just really important to remember that, people of color and Black and brown communities in particular are being disproportionately affected by this virus. And we're still only mostly seeing headlines about that. We're not hearing that many people's stories. And there's a reason that my story went viral. And I think it's because, a lot of people who, whether they were young or whether they were, white people or college educated people or people who maybe have access to social distancing, who didn't think that they could get this thing, they saw my story and it scared them, and that's good that they connected with it, and obviously that's important. But I also just want to say that there's a lot of other stories that are not being told because maybe the face of that story is not as media friendly in certain ways. And I just think that we need to continue to share stories from all communities because oral histories are hugely important in fighting any disease and any pandemic, but certainly one that's as politicized as this one has become.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that, Fiona. And thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wrap up here, but if anyone is interested, we are going to talk again on Instagram, on QuickTake's Instagram next. But thank you all for watching, and thank you, Fiona, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maddie. And thanks to everyone who tuned in and asked questions.